So you're in for a treat tonight. We have our Matt Bertone, who is the director of the Plant Disease and Insect Clinic at NC State. He's the entomologist, and we have Mike Munster, who is the pathologist. So he deals with the diseases, and they get samples from across the state as well as from other states to identify different insects, different diseases. Uh, and I've heard these guys speak, and they are both just, it blows my mind how much knowledge these gentlemen have in their heads. And so I'm going to let y'all get started. Matt, you must be going first.
Actually,
I'll
Mike's
let
gonna
you
run
get
it,
started
and
then.
yeah, he can start off.
Okay.
So
All right. So
Okay. So Mike's going to start us off.
good evening, everyone. And just let me clarify that I am one of 3 full-time pathologists in the clinic. So it takes 3 of us to handle all the disease diagnoses, and we have a division of labor. So my area of major responsibility is for the commercial ornamental, so things coming out of the greenhouse and nursery industry.
and
But
there are a lot of diseases, and they take a lot of time. So I'm very thankful for everyone in the lab.
yes, it's a good team. Matt and I will be talking to, this is going to be, I think, a good, enjoyable presentation for you and for us, because we seldom do this. We're going to today kind of pop that latch and prop up the hood and look and see how these insects, these diseases, what they operate under, what the principles underlying their biology are, to hopefully help you, as we say in the title, prevent damage by plant pests and pathogens. And the publicity for this presentation asked a question along the lines of, have you ever wondered why when you see several plants together and only one is sick? And that's a really great way to introduce the topic. So let me just see, since Debbie's going to be monitoring the chat here for us, I'm going to ask what you think might be going on here. Here are 2 Indian hawthorns. They are 80 yards apart. They're at 2 different ends of a building, the next building over from us here. And what do you think might be happening that one has got all this leaf spot on it and the other one doesn't? They're both Indian hawthorns. So yeah, what might be going on? Anybody want to venture? And I'm going to try and, at least for this one, sneak over to the Zoom controls and look at the chat.
Lynn says it might be mites.
The question though is why one is affected and not the other? One gets more sun, okay. Too much water. All right. Well, that just kind of, going to prime the pump for us to get us thinking about these principles. And I am going to change the slide and let Matt take you on the beginning of our journey.
All right, so the principle and why we have a lab that does this is the first principle is identifying the pest or pathogen correctly is the first and most important step. If you can't identify what's going on, it's just like if you have a plumber come out or any technician come out, if you can't identify the problem, you can't fix it. And so this is the first major thing to do when you want to control or manage or solve a problem with your plants out there.
We're going to say beep, or what was the signal going to be there? Just
Yeah, you
on
can change
pause.
it now. But first, remember, most organisms don't cause harm or damage. In fact, for arthropods, and we'll talk about them a lot more throughout this talk, most things are just going about doing their thing and they're not harming anything. And so just because you see something does not mean it's causing any issues. Don't have such a negative look on the world. So, for instance, innocent bystanders. So these are the fall guys, as Mike puts it. So just because a critter is present on a plant doesn't mean it's feeding on it or causing damage. These click beetles are there on these plants. They're probably waiting for the flowers to open, or they're feeding on pollen or something. But just because they're there, don't freak out and think that they're going to cause a problem. Lots of arthropods crawl around and land on various plants. They perch on plants to look for food. So don't blame an innocent bystander. And actually, some of these bystanders are beneficial. So if you do kill them just because you're afraid, you're not only killing something that doesn't deserve to be killed, but also you may be harming your plants in other ways by killing things that are actually helping them. So, for instance, a couple of fall guys are the bark lice. So these are very common on plants. They are not plant pests at all. They feed on algae and spores and things like that on the surface. But sometimes you see on the bottom right the eggs on the undersides of green leaves like hollies and camellias, or these little families of these little aphid-like insects. And some people freak out. They see a big group of them and they think, "Oh, I got to spray this. It's going to kill my tree." They get in a panic. But if you just identified it, you'd know that these are harmless to the plants. And so you don't want to kill an innocent bystander. Another group, and there's lots of groups out there that are really just innocent bystanders, are, for instance, plant hoppers. So they may cause some kind of wax on the plants. They may look a little strange. May look a little suspicious, especially that one in the center with those funky eyes, looking like it's doing bad things. But they're gonna, even though they're feeding on the plants, unlike the bark lice, they're feeding on the plants. But just because something's feeding on a plant also does not mean it's going to damage the plant. And it is a very, very, very rare occasion where one of these would damage a plant, and I've never seen it. So if you see these, you can leave them alone. You don't have to just kill everything out there.
And if I had included it for brevity, I didn't include slides of this, but another fall guy would be lichens. Now, of course, no one here on this Zoom meeting would make this mistake, but some people see lichens on the surface of a plant and think, "Oh, this is the problem. This is what's causing it." But of course, they are not. I'd like to introduce at this point a concept that our turf pathologist, Lee Butler, introduced to me 2 years ago. Basically the same idea, though, but now if you see a fungus or an arthropod, don't assume it's a primary problem and ask instead the question, am I looking at a lion or a buzzard? Or maybe it's a friend. So if you see a carcass on the side of the road with buzzards at it, you would not say, "Oh, look, the buzzards killed that poor deer." No, they were just coming in on the carrion. It was something else that was responsible. And just as one quick example of this, I have the question to pose: are mushrooms good or bad? Well, here we have a couple of examples from landscape beds, again here on campus. The fungus Desarmalaria on the left, and the fungus Leucocoprionis on the right. And it turns out that the one on the left is a lion. It will actually infect plant roots and in some cases kill trees and shrubs. The one on the left is a saprobe, just breaking down organic matter in the substrate there in the compost or in the soil. And in fact, this is one that may pop up in houseplants. It's called the yellow parasol or the yellow houseplant mushroom. And I didn't include a picture, but you can also have quite a few mushrooms that are beneficial because they're forming mycorrhizal relations with the tree roots below.
Now, another concept to think about is that many plants and other organisms have co-evolved. So, native plants, for instance, and you might call them pest systems, have been evolving for over thousands or millions of years. Even here in the U.S., where we think everything's new, these plants and insects have been around forever. There may be an arms race, but they are used to each other and their natural kind of interactions. These plants can typically tolerate the feeding damage throughout the season. So one of my big questions is always, can you tolerate it? This is not something that you're doing that's necessarily for the plant's benefit. For instance, these Yopon hollies and these native psyllids that cause these galls, these curled leaves on them. The plant is not going to die from it. The plant is not really, has been around for thousands or millions of years with this plant louse. And but it's more, do you want to tolerate it? Does it make your plant look bad? Are you doing this for you or for the plant? And that's a big thing to ask yourself. And to know that you have a native system and some kind of system that's been around for ages, it's not going to be this thing that's going to kill your plants or be detrimental.
The flip side of that is that if you have something that is introduced and is in a situation where perhaps it's not around any of its natural control, its hyperparasites or predators, then you can have outbreaks that are quite destructive. And I could give a couple examples from plant pathology where things that were native and well tolerated by species here caused a lot of destruction when they got overseas. For example, downy mildew on grape when it got to Europe, or the pine wilt nematode when it got to Asia. Sort of along the same lines as the can you tolerate it, I'd like to talk about, focusing just specifically for a moment on trees and shrubs, the scale of importance or intensity or severity of diseases. So just saying you have a disease doesn't mean that all are created equal. Um, this is basically my opinion. There are a few exceptions, but just as a general rule, the leaf spots and powdery mildews are going to be the least significant in terms of the long-term health of the plant. So they're often pretty much cosmetic, especially on our deciduous plants that are going to drop those leaves anyway at the end of the season. Then more severe would be canker diseases, where you're losing entire branches, or it could be just the tips, or it could be more substantial branches. Root rot's more serious yet, where you're affecting the ability of the plants to withdraw water and nutrients from the soil. And vascular wilts, where the xylem basically gets plugged up and you get some real serious effects. And among these would be, for example, Dutch elm disease, or more recently, laurel wilt. And as an example of not exactly the same concept, but the idea that some things are dramatic but not problematic. So this is the time of year we've already had one image sample come in of this. On the left is slime flux, which is the oozing of fermented sap that comes out of cracks and wounds in the usually in the base, but somewhere in the trunk of hardwood trees in the heat of the summer. White oaks are particularly commonly affected, but this in and of itself is not a problem. You may even see insects congregate there, just attracted by the nice fermenting odors. Another one we've seen so much of this year, oak leaf blister. So it starts out with the greenish blister-like formations on the leaves, but then come late May, early June, these turn dark and people think the disease is expanding or spreading. And in fact, it's just that those spots that were infected are dying out. So a cosmetic injury, even in severe cases where you can get a lot of defoliation, trees can handle that. If they're otherwise healthy, they can handle a round of defoliation.
And what Mike said had inspired me to put in this slide that basically it's the same for insects. You know, foliage feeders, needle feeders, they may strip a plant, but if it's not happening year after year and the plant is able to grow, and especially the late season leaf feeders, they're not going to be an issue to a plant. It may make the plant look ragged or unthrifty to you, but again, there's some native populations. So oakworms are a good example that feed on oaks late in the season. They may strip some branches of leaves, but that oak doesn't care. It's going to be fine. It's going to grow out of it. It's going to grow new leaves the next year. But then we look at other insects and arthropods like root feeders. You know, there are a lot of insects that feed on roots. They don't always become an issue, but every once in a while, there are higher populations. They may hurt turf or other plants. And then, you know, similar to the vascular wilt and some other diseases, we would talk about primary borers and disease transmitters, I would think are the most important arthropods, especially like peachtree borer and great squash vine borer. Those are going to bore right into the base of the plant. They're going to cut off the lifeline of the plant and are very severe pests. And then things that transmit diseases, especially viral things that transmit viruses, they will transmit, you know, it only takes one feeding event to transmit, or a couple to transmit a virus, but then that plant will suffer the rest of its life with the virus. And so we really worry about those transmitting those diseases. So one of the best things you could do for plants is to grow plants in the correct place. So cultivating happy plants means that they can better defend themselves. They're happier, they're healthier in general. And so next slide. One of the best things to use is actually something that was developed here at NC State in the horticulture department, the Extension Gardener Plant Toolbox. And the URL is right down there at the bottom. But if you just search Plant Toolbox NC State, you're going to find this. And basically, this has loads of information about a lot of horticultural species and even natural native species of plants. And it tells you all about where to best plant them, when to best plant them, whether they're toxic, what types of pests, things like that. It's just a huge resource for if you're selecting a plant, say you want to plant a button bush, it'll tell you where to plant that. If you want to plant a beautyberry, or if you want to plant some flowers in the bed, this will tell you whether it needs sun or shade, whether it needs well-drained soils, things like that. If you put a plant in the correct spot, it's going to be better off from the get-go. As soon as you plant it in the wrong spot, it's going to be kind of already hobbled for life, and it's gonna be struggling at some point.
And this URL is one of the ones that next time you're at the tattoo parlor, go ahead and have that written on your forearm. And then the other one could be our PDIC clinic address, because it is so useful. I make so much use of this particular site myself, both for work and for pleasure. All right.
Okay, another thing is, because of this, plants that are stressed can actually harbor more arthropod pests. So arthropods can actually be symptoms of plant stress. So oftentimes they can naturally repel or kill or just kind of defend themselves or even tolerate pests. But once they're a little sicker or once they're stressed, these pests have a better time establishing. And in fact, they found that some of these plants, when they get stressed, they produce chemicals or physiologically are more healthy or more nutritious to those insect pests. In fact, Steve Frank in our department, they did a big study on gloomy scales and found that they're much more abundant on maples that are in cities and urban areas, places where it's hot and dry and the plants are more stressed. Out in the woods, the maples have far fewer pests. It could also be because of the abundance of beneficials, but a stressed plant is going to be already kind of on the worst foot from the get-go, and these insects then can establish better and can start to push it more over the edge. And one thing I really, really like to drill home with people is that another fall guy that is also related to this kind of concept of stress plants are more attractive to insects are the bark, ambrosia, and wood boring beetles. So all the time I get people saying, wood borers killed my plant, or I found a wood borer in here. It must be the thing that killed my plant. But that's really very rarely the case. So most wood borers, the majority of wood borers, ambrosia beetles, and bark beetles are secondary. They're a symptom of a stressed plant or a plant that's conducive to them feeding on it. They won't develop in healthy plants. And in fact, some wood borers will actually girdle plants specifically to make them unhealthy because they can't survive in a healthy plant. There are a few cases of primary borers. For instance, red bay ambrosia beetle will attack healthy bay laurels and sassafras and things like that. There are certain pine beetles that will attack pines, but they're very sporadic. And as soon as you know the symptoms and the actual identification, you know that this is this primary and very difficult situation. In most of these other cases, if you see borers in the plants or dead branches or these toothpicks coming out of the stems, it means that the plant was stressed and it's calling out with chemicals, things we can't smell. And until we see that it's declining, we don't know, but the beetles can home in really quickly. And so you get situations like this on the right where these plants were probably planted too deep or poorly or is not drained enough. And you get these borers, these ambrosia beetles and bark beetles attacking them. So don't blame the beetles. Don't think that if you destroy the beetles, they're going to be gone. Really keeping your plants healthy is the key. And of course, another principle is that pests may have broader, narrow host ranges. So just two beetles here. The Japanese beetle on the left feeds on over 275 species of plants in numerous families. We see them feeding on grapes and roses, which are not technically closely related, or even lots of other hosts out there. Whereas this tulip poplar weevil on the right really mainly feeds on tulip poplar, liriodendron. And in fact, that's really where their larvae only develop. And it does sometimes feed on magnolia, but both are very close relatives. And so it's a very narrow host range on that beetle.
Likewise with the pathogens, they can have a broad or a narrow host range. So root knot nematodes, I realize that's a genus, it includes a number of species, but those have wide host ranges. These uh, hydrangea paniculatas dropping leaves and very unhappy. They had the roots infested with root knot nematode, and we usually think of it in the vegetable garden, but there are so many hosts. Whereas black spot of rose, that fungus, Diplocarpon rosei, only affects roses. And of course, there's everything in between, things like Phytophthora, Flaviopsis that have broad host ranges, but not enormous, depending on the species.
So at the end of the day, it's also not always a biological pest. So, Mike, I guess this is, oh yeah. So abiotic issues are very common. In fact, I would say we estimate about 30% of the things that come in either have an abiotic component or are completely caused by some kind of abiotic issue. And we'll mention one biotic thing in a second, but technically, but environmental problems are really common. It's either too cold or too hot. There's not enough water or too much water, lacking or excessive nutrients, or even just physical damage from hail, wind, or other forces of nature. And one technically biological issue, but isn't any pest or pathogen issue, is Homo sapiens. So humans are one of the biggest pests of plants. In fact, misapplying chemicals, planting poorly on the wrong site, as we mentioned, or even over loving. Some people think that they're doing well by their plants, but they're really doting over them too much and they kind of suffocate them, maybe literally or figuratively. And so these things that humans do, the plant would have been fine without those, but the human made the wrong mistake and is the cause of these issues.
And for those of you who haven't seen this particular kind of damage before on that tomato leaf, that is classic glyphosate injury. So that tomato got a whiff of the herbicide glyphosate, and the base of the leaflets turned bright yellow like that, sometimes almost white. Well, I want to say one of the places that's we have available on our website that's quite helpful for anticipating what kind of problems could be out there is our BOLOs, or be on the lookout. So if you go to our webpage, and we don't have the URL there, but it's pdic.ces.ncsu.edu, or just you can do a web search for Plant Disease and Insect Clinic, NC State, and on the menu on the left there, we have the BOLO menu that will take you to a set of pages, one per month, to highlight some of the things to expect in North Carolina landscapes and gardens during that particular month of the year.
Okay. Well, I guess this is my section now. So I'm going to talk to you about some principles of arthropod pests, and then Mike will follow with some pathogen principles, and we'll wrap it up with a few other things. So first, arthropods, what are they? You might be asking yourself that, and maybe you haven't heard that word much. And so, just before I continue, so arthropods are invertebrates with a hard exoskeleton, body, and appendages divided into segments and other features. So this spider and this assassin bug are both arthropods, but this includes insects, arachnids like spiders and mites, myriapods like centipedes and millipedes, and some others. There's even some things that we like to eat, like shrimp and crabs and lobsters and things like that in the ocean. But it is the most common and diverse group of animals you encounter, especially on a daily basis. I mention this to people other than I think squirrels and birds, and we're not going to count your pets or your children, which may be like animals sometimes. These arthropods are definitely the most common group of animals that you see, and everybody's familiar with them. Everybody has a story about them. Now, one thing to note is they all have a life cycle, and not all stages are pests. So arthropods do develop gradually or through stages, and this is called metamorphosis. And we've all kind of learned this in grade school, but certain insects go through a very simple metamorphosis where they hatch from an egg. The nymph is very similar to the adults, just kind of little looking. Um, these typically feed on very similar things. So they typically don't move host plants or whatever. So the young feed on the same plant as the adults. For instance, if you see a whole group of milkweed bugs, you often see all the life stage, or at least all the instars, the young, all the way to the adults on the same plant. Things that go undergo complete metamorphosis, though, go through the egg, a larva, a pupa, which is a resting stage between the larva and the adult. Um, and this is actually, they think evolutionarily, this is a reason for, there's a way for insects to not compete with themselves or their group when they're adults, and to be able to adapt to different um, modes of life. And it's really advantageous to have a larva that can feed and gain energy and then grow up to be something that's mobile and doesn't rely on that resource. So for instance, on the left here, that's a unicorn caterpillar, and it turns into a moth. And the caterpillar is a leaf feeder. The moth doesn't feed at all or feeds on nectar. And so one is technically a pest and the other is not, despite whether you like it or not. Um, some, when they, as far as the life cycles, some have a life cycle that happens multiple times per year, so they're called multivoltine, while others only once or twice. So, for instance, some insects, like those oakworms I mentioned, and even Japanese beetles, for instance, you only see the adults one time a year. Then they mate, they lay eggs, and then their larvae exist the rest of the time. And then the next year, you have the cycle complete again. And so this is a univoltine species. It has one life cycle per year. And knowing this about each species can help you manage the timing and whether control is actually necessary. And it may be different between the different stages. Now, another principle is about scouting. So how do you know you have insect pests? Well, you can see the damage, and we'll talk about the damage in a minute. But scouting and scouting and scouting is really important. A lot of people say, oh, I've see all this damage, but I can't find anything that's causing it. Well, it's really important, obviously, to find the culprit, because some general chewing damage I may not be able to ID, but the culprits could be different enough to warrant different control. Um, so since insects are and arthropods are mobile, Mike has a little easier sometimes with the pathogens because they don't run away or fly away or whatever. Um, since they're mobile, they can be gone by the time the damage is done. So finding them can be a game of hide and seek. So the principle is always look under leaves. So insects like to hide under leaves. They don't like to be exposed to the sun and predators and things like that. And so oftentimes they're found on the undersides of leaves. Spider mites, scale insects often, white flies, things like that. Also, one thing to really be aware of is scouting at different times of day and night. So basically, different insects have different activity times. Certain things are called crepuscular. This is one of my favorite words ever, and that's where they're active at dusk or dawn or both. Whereas others are diurnal, which means they're day active, or they're nocturnal and night active. And in fact, I just had a sample come in where a person noticed their plant was being chewed up by things. They didn't see anything, and then they went out at night and it was loaded with beetles. And they were able to send me a number of these specimens. It was pretty easy to ID them, and then we were able to get them advice on how to control them. So definitely when you're scouting, be persistent, go out at different times of day, look around really well, and definitely document it. Now, one good thing also is know your damage and the possible culprits. So I'm going to go over a list of some types of damage that arthropods cause, and then a couple of the general culprits for these. So the first is a main one that people think of, and that's defoliation. This is feeding damage that completely or mostly strips the leaves, including needles on pines and other conifers, off of a plant. And there's lots of insects that have very strong mandibles. They can chew right through that material. They process a lot. They often defecate a lot as well. And so this is often caused by caterpillars, beetles, or sawflies. And these are the major things that will do that. The next is they're a little daintier feeding, but these are skeletonizers. So they like to feed on the kind of the tissue that's a little softer in between the veins of the plant, and so they cause the plant to look like a skeleton, and that's why we call it skeletonizing. So it's either partially or completely eaten between the leaf veins. It's sometimes called window painting when the tissue is not entirely fed through. You can see that on the bottom left of those slug sawfly larvae, and feeding on I think it was a prunus. And so they're just kind of feeding on the really nice tender stuff. This is often caused by beetles, sawflies, or caterpillars. Now, leaf mining is a type of damage where the larva lives inside the leaf and basically exists between the upper and lower surface of the leaf. They can be linear, like at the top right, or blotch-like on the bottom left. They can even go from linear to blotch-like, like that center bottom photo on a blueberry. So these insects do that as a larva, and then they bore out and then kind of emerge as an adult to go lay eggs in other plants. And this is most often caused by flies, caterpillars, or beetles. Now, galls can be caused by lots of different types of organisms, but arthropods in general, there are a lot of groups of arthropods that can cause galls. Now, galls are really just tumor-like growths that are caused by the actual insect. And so, again, lots of different organisms can cause this, but in arthropods, you've got a lot of flies, bugs, mites, and wasps that do that. So, for instance, on the top, those two leaves, the one on the left is caused by an aphid on witch hazel. The one on the right is caused by a wasp on oak. The one on the bottom left is a wasp that causes galls on raspberry, and it's related to the oak gall wasp. Those bullseyes on the maple leaf are from a fly. We've got a wasp on an oak in the middle. Then that star-like one is on a hickory. It's from a fly. And then the one on the bottom right is actually from jumping plant lice. So you can see that lots of different things create galls. Now, inside the plants, you can have, we'll say wood boring, although they can bore, there are insects that bore into herbaceous plants too. But this is feeding and tunneling in tissue or under bark, usually wood, but sometimes herbaceous plants. And this is often caused by beetles, sawflies, or caterpillars. For instance, the top right is a carpenter worm caterpillar that can bore, it can chew right into that really dense wood. But you have lots of wood borers, bark beetles, and clearwing moth borers like our below middle, that little pupa that's in there. There you go.
Sorry, I'm having
Yeah, no worries.
mouse control issues.
um, Distortion or malformation. So this is where plant growth is abnormal in size and or shape and texture. This is often caused by mites, bugs, and thrips, so sucking arthropods. So again, the tissue isn't taken away, but something in their saliva or something there actually something making the plants physiologically grow in distorted leaves. And usually these have to actually feed on the plant while it's developing. They can't typically cause distortion on fully expanded leaves. So these are things that like to feed on the tender new growth and cause that really distinct damage. But of course, I put a note here that herbicides and viruses can also cause these symptoms, as well as a lot of other things. So basically, this is why, identifying the actual culprit is really important. Now, discoloration can happen too. So the feeding itself can cause the plants to either lose their color, like the bottom leaves, camellia leaves, which are getting yellow from T-scale. The bottom right is a viburnum leaf that was fed on by thrips, and basically the tissue pulled apart to make it silver. And then the top left is the purple patches caused by the feeding of a type of plant louse on this. I think it's an Echinacea rudbeckia. I think it's a rudbeckia. And this is most often from, again, sucking arthropods like bugs and mites. Of course, thrips are down there on the right, but bugs and mites are the most common cause of discoloration on plants. And finally, flagging and branch damage. So this is actually fairly relevant. We, in fact, just got a sample in the lab of a blueberry that had cicada damage on it. So this is physical damage to twigs on trees and bushes, and they may break and hang on, looking like flags, like that center photo. So sometimes this is from feeding, sometimes from egg laying, and some on purpose to make dead wood. So for instance, I've never seen these yet, but I would love to see one. On the right is an Oncidurces. It's a type of longhorn beetle that's called a twig girdler, and they often apparently feed on hickories. And what they do is they actually go to a live hickory twig, chew a perfect girdle around it, and then they lay their egg in the tip of that part so that they're actually creating their own dead wood. So again, this just goes to show you that they can't really feed on the plant otherwise. They have to kill it to make a better home for their young. And so this is most often from bugs, ovipositing, and beetles. But also things like sapsuckers and squirrels can cause this physical damage when they chew on the branches, or girdle the twigs and the stems and cause this damage.
And if I can interject, sometimes it's a fungus too that's caused a canker, and the branch died from that point outward. Or
Mhm.
even something like fire blight. We saw a lot of fire blight this year on things like apple and pear, where you get the bacteria working its way down.
Now, Mike mentioned this a little bit before, but invasive pests are actually often more damaging than native pests. And of course, pests is all relative. It really depends on your opinion of it and whatnot. But for instance, crepe myrtle bark scale, nobody would ever say it's not a pest here in the US. Now, where it's from in the native range, it may be on these plants at low levels and nobody cares about it. But we brought crepe myrtles here, we planted them everywhere, and they were fine for a long time, for many decades. And then 10, 15 years ago, this pest of the plant came into the US and it spread. It was basically like a buffet for this insect. So they don't have really many natural predators. We do have predators of them here and parasitoids, but they're not well equipped enough to completely control them. And this is where you get these huge outbreaks of the pest. And some of these things also transmit diseases, so they bring with them pathogens that can actually harm the plants as well. So invasive pests are typically much more of a problem to plants than native pests.
All right. I am going to take the wheel here and talk a little bit about the concepts underlying plant disease, or the inner logic of why this work, that hopefully will serve as the basis of understanding of how to prevent, preferably, and manage plant disease. And the thing that we plant pathologists lead off with is something called the disease triangle, which, well, um, let me first, you've heard the saying, it takes two to tango. Well, think about it. It's not really true. You need three. You got to have the music. So that applies here as well. We've got the disease triangle, which means that you need to have three elements and they have to be together in order for you to have disease. One of those is a competent pathogen. A pathogen just means a microorganism capable of causing disease. You have to have a susceptible host plant, and you have to have, here's the music, the favorable environment. And of course, these things have to interact over a period of time. So we're not talking about things that are causing instantaneous damage, but the development of the plant pathogen interaction that leads to symptoms. What groups of plant pathogens are there? And be another talk to go into these in detail, but basically the four big ones are fungi, and they get the blue ribbon, bacteria and nematodes, which are roundworms, usually in most species they're affecting the roots of plants, and viruses, which are submicroscopic. With whatever group of those you have, you've got some things to think about. One is, how do they survive adversity? So when the conditions are unfavorable, too hot or too cold, or there's no host plant around, how are they going to manage? Well, there's three basic strategies. One is that you survive on living host plants. That could be weeds around, things that are alive during the winter weeds, or it could be on woody tissue and buds or cankers on a branch. The second strategy would be as resting structures in the soil, resting spores, for example, down there at the bottom center. Those are the Alluria spores of, it's called Bertholliomyces now, Ortholabiopsis, that causes black root rot. Or it could be sclerotia, these radish seed-like structures that developed from the fungus Sclerotium rolfsii, now Athelia rolfsii. No, they changed it again. But our friend rolfsii here that causes southern stem blight. Or in the case of nematodes, eggs surviving in the soil. And the third general category is on dead plant materials. So we call these the saprobic life stage, where it may be able to infect living plants, but also survives on dead plant materials, such as in your compost, which is why you don't want to toss diseased plants into the compost bin. Now, those that survive in the soil in one way or another can be divided into two general categories: soil invaders and soil inhabitants. So the soil invaders are usually associated with plant tissue, so that once it breaks down, then you're home free, sort of. The red line on the graph would indicate a soil invader situation. These are just made up numbers, but the idea is to see the difference in the curve. So after a few years, the population has dropped precipitously, and you can go ahead and, let's say, plant back with some crucifers that had black rot at one time, because all the old material is decomposed and the bacteria that caused that have diminished to the point where they're not going to be a problem. Versus a soil inhabitant, like the bacterium that causes southern bacterial wilt, that is only going to decline very slowly, if at all, especially if there are weeds that are alternate hosts, then you're really not going to be able to do any kind of crop rotation and get you away from this. So you may have some that are fairly short rotation, others with a long, and others that it's going to be a permanent part of your soil microbiota. Another concept that's helpful to remember, this within, again, the disease triangle, and thinking about the host side of things, is that diseases tend to run in families. So if you have a plant, you're not sure what kind of problems it has, but you know what family it belongs to, then that is often very helpful as to what to expect. So famously, fire blight, which was mentioned a little bit ago, gets on apples, pears, cotoneaster, a few other hosts, but not on stone fruits. So if you have peaches, no, that's not fire blight. Returning, though, to the subject of the survival of our pathogens, here's an example of one that doesn't survive at all in North Carolina. This is cucurbit downy mildew. And as it happens, yesterday, the announcement came out that the day before, it was confirmed for the first time this year in North Carolina. It only survives in warmer climates, say Florida, and then each year makes its way north on wind currents. And sometime, this is a pretty typical time for it to show up, it will appear in North Carolina, and then growers have to be aware of it. And this one is, you hope, though, that it's only making its way up that way, and that someone didn't bring transplants infected from an area where it overwintered. So that's another issue we'll kind of touch on later. But this then is a segue into the next concept here.
And Mike, before you
Yes.
go, I want to just say a parallel that this also happens with arthropod pests. There are things like fall armyworm and a few other moths that can't survive here over winter here in North Carolina, and but they do persist and cycle in Florida and the Gulf states. And then as their populations grow, they start to move up and get swept up on in storms and things like that, and move up the coast. And so you see them later and later in the year, or up north, up even further north than us. They get them later than we do. So they won't exist here, but they're fairly consistent going to be here. We just don't know when.
And just to clarify, he's talking about the adult moths coming up on the storms, not the worms, not the caterpillars themselves. All right. Maybe he said that. Sorry if you already did.
I don't know. Maybe there was a worm that was blown up here too, but we'll see.
A really powerful tornado. So that gets us thinking about something else, which is, how do these things move around? How do they disseminate? And I have this micrograph here, or two micrographs next to one another, with the question, how do you think these spores would get around from place to place? So you have this little cluster of spores in some kind of a droplet of liquid in this case, and here you have a developing chain of spores, dry and just hanging out there in the air. And this is, as you might expect, the one on the right, which is a powdery mildew, would be wind disseminated. So air currents are going to move this around, although of course water splash could as well. But in this case here, that sticky droplet is not going to be easily moved around in the wind. So it's going to be by rain splash, water movement, or perhaps by insects, by sticking to the body of insects. And in general, we can say that the methods that these different pathogens disperse are 4. Water, either running or splashing water; wind, as we mentioned; insect and mite vectors, we call them, that move the pathogens around, either incidentally or because they are themselves infected; and finally, people and tools and vehicles. And I want to, well, first of all, just keep in mind this concept. Anytime you move soil and anytime you move live plants or plant parts, you could be moving pathogens. On the left, these are bibs of Rhatz liriope that had anthracnose, fusarium crown rot, and root knot nematode, and that's the planting material, right? The picture on the right is a fig with fig mosaic. If you do a nice air layering and produce a new fig tree, you're also going to have that virus or those viruses carried along with it. Another kind of scary example is, and this is nothing proven here, but we had a case, I think it was a year before last now, where some trillium from a botanical garden type area had a disease on it, and it was something called smut, which wasn't reported in North Carolina before. It was known in the Pacific Northwest. That was kind of a puzzle there. But it turns out that one of the volunteers at that garden was from Oregon and may have brought a trillium plant or plants from there to here. So for the love of all that is good, do not do that. Likewise, do not move firewood. Returning then to that host point of the triangle and thinking about how we can actually manipulate or influence what's going on with the host, with the pathogen, with the environment to try and get ahead of disease or manage it. Well, the reason, and I had to think about this too, I wondered, like you did, if there was some kind of a microclimate difference between those two ends of the building, that they were maybe wetter, shadier on one side, and that's why there was all this disease. It's called entomosporium leaf spot, versus the other side of the other end of the building. But then a couple of years ago, I noticed when they were in bloom, and I thought, they're different cultivars. So this is a disease that you can manage if you're there on the ground floor, so to speak, when the selection is made of what cultivar of Indian hawthorn to plant. Be sure and choose one that is resistant to entomosporium leaf spot, or you will be facing the situation on the left. Then the third point of the triangle is that which is the environment. And one of the key factors in the environment is water. Now, plants very seldom actually drown. They have to be, the roots saturated with water for days, but water often favors disease. So we always tell people, don't plant a house plant in a pot that doesn't have a drainage hole, right? You're denying oxygen, too much water, and you're going to favor these disease organisms. On the left there, that's Acidivorax on the cannas there, but a problem you would see in production, versus on the right, that dusty mildew had Rhizoctonia and Pythium root rots and Phytophthora aerial blight. So these are things that in terms of the Phytophthora and the Pythium, that water favors them. It tends to favor these water molds, which are not true fungi, but they behave like fungi. So things like Pythium Phytophthora and the downy mildews, as well as our bacterial diseases. There are two different reasons for this. That said, what do we want to do when we think about managing water? So there are a few do's and don'ts. One is plant in raised beds. This is a huge benefit to being able to get good drainage, not have excess water, and have fewer problems with things like Phytophthora and Pythium. Avoid overwatering and avoid overhead irrigation if possible. If that's not possible, then we'll refer you to the fifth point, or the fourth and fifth. Water when foliage will dry quickly, and if overhead irrigation is necessary, don't extend the nighttime wetness period. Well, what does that mean? That means, if you think about it, on a typical summer day, somewhere in the early morning hours, I put on this graph 4 o'clock until maybe 8:30 in the morning, the plants just have a natural dew formation on them many nights. And what you want to avoid is either watering it before so that it stays wet all night, or watering it so early in the morning that you have extended that period, because it's the number of hours of wetness that often affect at a certain temperature, right? That affect whether let's say a fungal pathogen, the spores are going to have time to germinate and infect before that water dries up. Another thing to think about with water, look at the pattern here in this landscape. These are Leyland cypress that turned out to have Phytophthora root rot. Where is the problem? Well, you can see here that there's a tree that is kind of yellowing, browning toward the bottom, just does not look good. There's a gap here. They probably didn't leave a space on purpose. That was probably a tree there that died and was removed. But notice where it is. It's on the low side. So one takeaway there is that low area is going to be where it's wetter and favorable for Phytophthora. The other thing is, notice that it isn't moving terribly fast. It's not running up the row, because these soil-borne pathogens tend to move on their own. They tend to move more slowly. Likewise would be the case if this had been armillaria root rot, which can grow, according to Sinclair and Lyne's book, from 0.2 to 2 meters per year in many temperate areas. And of course, you would ask the question here, is that crepe myrtle going to get it? Well, likely not, because it's up here in a much drier spot. It's on a nice raised bed, and we don't really see Phytophthora root rot on crepe myrtle. So there's a difference there in the susceptibility of the species. I want to mention too about pruning, because that is a good strategy for managing canker diseases where you have an infection in the wood. Just be careful to get several inches at least down into where you have clean cambium, healthy cambium and clean wood, which may not be obvious when you first are looking at it. So, look under the bark and look in that cross section, make sure you've gotten there. Also, of course, all the good pruning practices about pruning to a node and so forth. And do sanitize your shears frequently, and do this on a dry day. Now, saying it's a strategy for canker diseases means that it is going to be likely ineffective against systemic infections. For example, rose rosette. Your chances of eliminating it just by pruning out the cane that's showing symptoms is going to be fairly low, especially if it's taken you a couple of weeks to notice it. That virus becomes systemic in the plant, and the whole thing will be infected. And of course, it's going to be pointless against any root diseases. Now, I know we're talking about prevention here today, but just in case someone has the feeling, hey, I still want to spray something. Well, okay, but remember these points. First of all, sprays are primarily to protect healthy foliage or fruit. They're not going to be eliminating established infections. So it won't help if the infection is well established. Also, again, it won't help against root diseases, or very seldom. So don't even think about it if you've got the problem as diagnosed as being a root disease. Also keep in mind, not all products work against all pathogens. So there is some specificity there in this. And if the weather is extremely conducive to disease, then your sprays are going to be ineffective. Finally, follow all label directions in terms of concentrations and the interval of application, re-entry interval, pre-harvest interval, and of course, personal protective equipment, not like this guy.
Mike, before you move on, I didn't mention anything specifically about arthropods because I don't typically talk about control, but there are some general rules similar to this for insects. Although I will say for arthropod pests, it isn't like fungi where you're trying to kind of protect the plant. It's more that you will actually kill the actual insects being active. But of course, timing is really important because they may do the damage or transmit the diseases before you even get to controlling them. But there are definitely lots of different pesticides, but knowing the type of arthropod is going to really help because certain arthropods are only susceptible to certain pesticides. And then certain pesticides and how they're applied can affect the beneficials and the things out in your yard. In fact, I'm not a big fan of spraying your yard to kill all the mosquitoes because those chemicals that people use are not specific to mosquitoes, and they're going to kill every other fly and beetle and other things around that are susceptible to it. And it's not very targeted. So definitely really consider a lot of things. Certain systemic pesticides are taken up by plants and then get into the nectar and the pollen that can then kill bees and pollinators that are helping the plants. There's a lot of things to consider when going toward chemical management of arthropods, and there are also a lot of ways to protect your plants otherwise, or control them either manually or culturally that don't involve chemicals.
All right. I see that we have 3 minutes left in the presentation here. So I'm going to just quickly flip through the last ones here to say that in some cases, sprays are not worth it because sometimes because it's not really a problem other than aesthetic, a cosmetic problem, and other times because it would be futile. So euonymus with powdery mildew, that's just so susceptible that you're not going to be able to do anything about it. There are, though, again, speaking only to the diseases, there are certain situations, especially in the home fruit orchard and sometimes in the vegetable garden and a few in ornamentals, where spraying might be useful. But try and keep in mind all the other things we've been talking about here. Don't immediately reach for the sprayer. And don't even immediately ask what or how do I control this? To tie the whole program together, ask yourself before you ask how do I control it, these questions. One is, does it require laboratory confirmation? Do I know for sure what I have? Another, what hosts are affected? Is this only going to affect the rose? Is it only going to affect the crepe myrtle, or is it going to affect 15 different things in my yard and the neighborhood? Third, what is the damage potential? Is it really going to cause any serious harm to either what I'm trying to harvest or to the long-term life of, let's say, a tree? Is it too late? Is it pointless to try and manage the problem because, well, either the damage is already done or because the susceptible life stage to any kind of control measure has already passed? Ask yourself what conditions or seasons are favorable for its development. And ask yourself, how does it survive unfavorable conditions like we talked about? So I know if rotation will be helpful, or I can manage that aspect. And how is it dispersed? So is it something I'm going to spread around on my pruners? Is it something that's going to get around on the wind by itself? Or is it something that I have to be careful about not moving myself? And then how is what is the infection? Is it something systemic throughout the plant, or is it something localized that I can prune out? So these are some good questions to start with. And we will just close at 7:59 p.m., wishing you all a successful year of gardening.
Awesome, and awesome photographs. Y'all are great photographers. All of the photos you have shown are so sharp and clear and very easy to see what you're talking about. There's no questions other than one about when's the best time to water in the chat box, and I've answered that as early morning so the foliage dries out quickly.
Yep, just don't prolong that leaf wetness period. So if it's wet, let it dry off first and then water it.
So
And
I don't need to go outside and water the plants that I put in the ground earlier today, right now.
Well, and one even closer to home, literally in the home, houseplants, people complain about fungus gnats and things like that, and it's often because they're overwatered. The larvae of the flies do need moisture, like fungi, like Mike's friends and everything. And so basically, if you dry it out, it's not going to be a conducive environment for them. It's almost like the disease triangle for insects. It's like they also do have a conducive environment that they need.
And let me add, this may not be the direction that the questioner was going, but when you ask when to water, when it's something like a tree or a shrub, remember that less frequent but deep is more important than frequent and shallow. And there's some really good resources online from the horticulture science department about that when you're trying to establish trees and shrubs.
So yes, going out with a hose and standing there for 5 minutes. If you dig down in the soil, water doesn't move very far. It has to be slow and steady, and you want to get it down, in most cases, 4 to 6 inches deep. Now, if you've got clay soil, it may start running off before that, so you may have to do it in smaller increments. Sheila's posted a question in the chat box about purple oxalis that is covered with rust. What should she do? Cut the leaves off and let it regrow?
She can if it's unsightly, and I would have to look up. I think there may be more than one species of rust that gets on oxalis, but if I remember right, the main one, or at least one of them, is a rust that has to alternate between unrelated hosts. So the spores from that oxalis are going to infect something else. And I don't want to say because I'm not 100% sure that I remember correctly, but it's going to infect something unrelated to oxalis and then come back. So I don't think, again, I have to look it up, that they're going to get repeat cycles on the oxalis itself. But of course, if those leaves are unsightly, then yeah, that's a robust enough plant that it will
Hmm.
come back after you trim
Recover.
a few leaves
That's
off.
that's a perfect example of knowing what the actual disease is or the organism is really important to know the biology. And yeah, we actually bought some native plants last fall, and one of the pycnanthemum, the mountain mints, had rust all over it. And we basically, it was looked like a healthy plant. So we're like, well, either it's gonna die or not. We're just gonna cut it down to the, and remove all the leaves and everything. It sprouted up this year, looks really great. I haven't seen any rust on it yet. Of course, I don't know the life cycle completely, but yeah.
Um, Sandy says, and I know her husband, I think he barbecues a lot because we usually get his barbecue for our holiday party. She says watering is like barbecue, low and slow.
Oh, sounds good.
And I have a question because last week we had some things coming into the extension office on Southern Red Oak, and you showed the leaf blister. We kind
Yes,
of thought it might have been Tubacia or anthracnose. The leaves were curled and falling off the trees. And it was several people that had this problem, and the whole tree had gone off color and the leaves were dropping. And our thing was, well, it's too late. It's a fungus disease. The trees will probably put out some new growth. And if it doesn't happen next year or the following year, the tree will be fine. Is that what y'all were seeing? Have y'all gotten multiple samples?
multiple samples of
Okay,
leaf blister this year. And
okay,
then, and this is a good example where I can almost, I will dare to speculate that the timing will tell you the answer. If it were anthracnose, which you really don't see much in oaks, as I recall here, that probably should have occurred earlier in the spring, if I'm not
okay.
mistaken. Tubacia is something you're not going to see until later in the year, so more into the late summer and into the fall. So this is prime time for those leaf blisters to
Leaf
start
blister.
turning from green to brown, and then people notice them, and then leaves dropping off.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So
but it's the same thing, right? That it won't kill the tree. It's just an aesthetic thing. The tree will recover. And if it doesn't happen several years in a row, the tree will be fine.
that's right.
Correct? And next
Yeah.
year, conditions may be totally different and it may not be a problem.
Yeah,
We have a lot
it
of
varies from year to year.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
have a lot of them on campus that have them. We have a whole row of I think they're Darlington oaks, or they're like a willow oak type, but they're really have a lot this year, but you may not see many next year depending on the conditions. This is the same for a lot of insects too, like gall making insects like phylloxera on hickories and pecans. We see some years you get a lot of them, and then the next year you may not have any, and it could be because it was a colder winter, or there were certain kind of conditions that were more conducive to the insects surviving and stuff. So there are actually a lot of parallels between the pathogens and the insects, because they're biological entities. They're going for these things and they're trying to survive. And some years are better for them and some years are worse.
yeah. Penny asked a question about laurel wilt, wanting to know if it kills the whole plant at once when it's infected, or will it kill it stem by stem?
Yeah, so Mike might know a little bit more about this than me. I don't, it is a vectored by a beetle, and so technically, I bet, if only a few beetles entered the plant in one branch and infected it, there probably would be a point where you could prune it out before it spread completely. But Mike is probably going to tell, I think catching that period would be very difficult. And by the time you notice it, I think that's the big problem, is by the time people notice things, sometimes they're too far gone. And maybe Mike has a little bit more information on how quickly that moves or whatnot.
I don't, but the other tricky thing, and I don't remember the numbers, but those beetles are not very good at finding slender stems. So they're going to be
Hmm.
finding things that are a little bit more well developed. So it's going to be
Yeah.
trees that already are basically a one stem tree, sassafras for sure, but more we see it on red bay. So if you do have sassafras, red bay, a few other in the Lauraceae, nobody would have avocado. Um, yes, I would expect that that would be something that the whole plant is going to be affected by, but I would have to double check.
Okay, insect question. Will we be getting the cicadas in Monroe, North Carolina? And I'm gonna speak to this first because I found one. I live in downtown Monroe, but I do home delivered meals, so I go out in the county. And I have heard them from a distance, but I've not seen hundreds or millions of them. So, but Matt, I'll let you address it too, please.
Yeah, yeah. So we're gonna assume you're talking about the periodical cicadas that have
Yes.
been making the news. And so those are the spring active. This brood that we're seeing in North Carolina right now is called Brood 19. It is a 13-year cicada, so that means these young have been underground since 2011. They were eggs and they hatched in 2011. They burrowed underground and were sucking on the plants until now, and then they mass emerged together. So, thankfully, Debbie let me know that there were some things there. They were very patchy here too. We had a lot of activity here in Wake County, and in my neighborhood, I saw skins a lot of places. I actually saw two adults in my yard. But I did not see the millions in my yard, but I could hear them in a neighborhood or two over. You could hear them really loud. So they're very sporadic and patchy, and they kind of have a congregation where they all once the party starts, they kind of start to move toward each other, and the ones that are out of the party, aren't as successful, and so they kind of find spots where they have them. So let's see, I've had hundreds. Okay, so yeah, exactly. So yeah, depending, you could be lucky or unlucky. Depends on your feelings about the cicadas, and having millions in your yard, and then maybe a mile away there's going to be none because they're very patchy. But you all might also be seeing next year's brood. So there's another brood, I think it's a 17-year cicada that is going to be emerging near the mountains of North Carolina, out west more. So this brood seemed to be much more abundant down from Charlotte through kind of Raleigh area, the kind of median area of North Carolina, a little bit more west. But this next brood, and of course, we've had a lot of different predictions that didn't come true. So some areas that we didn't think that we're going to have as many had more this year, because we can't track them every year because it's only every 13 or 17 years, depending on the brood. It's very hard to predict where they're going to be. So I will say they have been out. And so they're probably declining right now. The populations are dying off. The young are going to develop and hatch out. So if you haven't seen them yet, you probably won't see them. But there are possibilities, as Debbie said, to go around your area and still see some. But within the next few weeks, it's probably going to be starting to get more quiet. But everybody everywhere in North Carolina will start to see in the summer the annual or dog day cicadas that come out every year. Predictably, they're the larger green and kind of brown, black colored ones that are kind of very much larger, kind of noisy, but not as many in one site.
They're edible too, right?
They are. They're not
They're
poisonous. They're
crunchy.
not dangerous. People apparently are cooking them. I saw somebody, I guess, that mixed them with alcohol and were making like shots with them and stuff. But so yeah, you can do whatever you want with them. I guess they're not
Saute them in a little
dangerous.
garlic and butter, and they're nice and crunchy.
Maybe, yeah, I guess I'm not a big insect eater, but if I was, they look very delicious. I mean, they're big and kind of slow and fat. So they've been feeding for 13 years, so they should be, I guess. But
I've seen an extension agent that I think her native country was Mexico, and she actually ate a live one.
yeah, a little
So
too prickly for me.
it's interesting to say. Jean, Jean doesn't think that's too funny. But I eat insects for protein, you know.
Yep.
And so we can take advantage of that if we need to. So
And a lot of
are there
wildlife does, of course,
any
too.
So anyway, lots of kudos. Thank you for the great information. Very informative. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Great. It's our
So
pleasure.
thank
And
you guys so much. We appreciate the great presentation.